Okay, now hang on a minute. Put down the keyboard. Yes, you with the balding pate at the back. It's always you, isn't it? Wanting to type a comment midway through the video until it's finished without watching the entire thing. And if you try and do that in this video, you're going to come unstuck, because we're going to go on a bit of a ride and there's going to be many different twists and turns along the way.
This episode is brought to you by the Bowers Wilkins PX7S2 wireless headphones. Hear what your music really sounds like.
Welcome back everybody. Today I want to talk about something new from Sony called the NW-A306. I think I'm just going to call it the 306 from here on in, but the NW means new Walkman. This is a new portable player from Sony, and it got my attention because A, it's small, so it's even smaller than an iPhone 13 mini. And B, I think it's actually the smallest Sony portable audio player that also features an Android operating system. In this case, I think it was Android 12, and therefore it features the Google Play Store app, from which we can install Spotify, Tidal, Qobuz, SoundCloud, Deezer, any streaming app we want. But as per many other dApps on the market, we can also playback files from a micro SD card inserted into the 306's undercarriage. And the idea behind Sony's new Walkman is to give us portable audio on the go whilst out and about with wired headphones. It does do Bluetooth wireless as well, but I'm not covering that in this video because generally whatever the Sony can do, you can do from an Android phone. I'm very much focused on its talents with wired headphones or wired earphones. I mainly used earphones, as we'll see, but because the Sony only weighs 113 grams, so it's even lighter than an iPhone 13 mini as well, we could drop it into a breast pocket and not be that troubled by it. But despite being small and despite being light, this new Sony Walkman does not feel cheap. It does not look cheap. It feels very nice and substantial in the hand. I really like the contoured back panel, and it just feels very well made. Along the bottom edge, we have a 3.5mm headphone socket, and that's it. There's no balanced here. We get a lanyard loop. We get a USB-C recharging socket, and then along the side we get an array of control buttons all the way up and down the sides. We've got on off, volume up and down, previous track, play pause, and next track, and then a lock button to lock those off in case you are prone to accidentally pressing them whilst they're in your pocket. Now, one thing I like that Sony have done here is they've put a couple of nipples on two of the buttons along the side, one of which is the play pause button, so that we don't get it confused when just going by touch and feel if we want to reach for the red hot chili peppers button, because yeah, sometimes that need becomes very urgent. Now let's get one thing out of the way early on regarding sound quality. In terms of detail retrieval and top end extension, I think this Sony sounds better than the Lightning to 3.5mm dongle when attached to an iPhone 13 mini. However, in the lower frequencies, in the bass region, I'm not so sure that the Sony is better. But to go further in assessing the Sony's value for money when using wired headphones, we need to establish a baseline. And yes, that means introducing a side-by-side comparison. And today that comes from the M3 Ultra from Shanling, which sells for €480, so that's €80 more than the Sony. And like the Sony, the Shanling is, wait for it, made in China. Now, Srajan Ebaen and I reviewed the Shanling M3 Ultra on the Darko Audio podcast about 3 weeks ago. So if you want to dig into that, I'll put the link in the description box below, because I'm not going to go deep on the Shanling today, only the Sony. For example, the Shanling has a 4.2-inch colour touchscreen and the Sony's is only 3.6 inches. I'll leave you to decide which one you think looks best, but I would say that the colours on the Shanling to me look a bit warmer than they do on the Sony. But the Shanling is bulkier, heavier, and its battery only lasts half as long, pretty much, as the Sony. And battery life is one of the A306's biggest selling points, I think. I mean, Sony are rating it at well north of 30 hours. And I think that they can pull this performance from their internal battery by doing 3 things. Number 1, I think Sony have specified a lower spec internal computing hardware system for their A306, because sometimes the UI, the Android UI, is a bit sluggish. Now, I wouldn't call the Shanling particularly snappy, but at least it's responsive and it doesn't kind of jolt and jar sometimes as the Sony does, but not always. It just catches you off guard when you swipe down and it kind of freezes halfway and then you have to swipe again. And I find that a little bit irritating. Moreover, sometimes when we press the Sony screen, there can be a longer than expected lag or longer than expected time delay between the press and then the response from the UI for that press. So this is not a snappy player, this is not a super responsive player, and I think most mid-range Android smartphones would just leave it in the shade, would blow it out of the water, would destroy it in terms of UI responsiveness. The second reason that I think that Sony can pull extra battery life from their new Walkman circuit is they are using digital amplifier technology called S-Master HX. Now, what that means is that there is no DAC chip inside this new Sony Walkman. There's an ESS DAC chip inside the Shanling, but there is not anything like that inside the Sony. What happens is that the stream arrives, or the file is played from the micro SD card, and that digital signal is routed all through the Sony's internal circuitry, and then that digital signal drives the output stage. That's why it's called a digital amplifier. And the third reason why I think that the battery life on this Sony can run for so long is that the output power from its headphone socket, from its 3.5mm headphone socket, I think is pretty low. So on the Shanling, they rate their player from its 3.5mm socket, I think at 140 milliwatts into 32 ohms. Now I looked up this spec on the Sony website, and I'm not even sure it's right, but it says 1.1 milliwatts into 32 ohms. And if that's true, that's substantially lower than the Shanling. But even though that number doesn't sound right to me, we can definitely notice that lack of power from the Sony when we connect a pair of earphones. Because I started out with the Sennheiser IE600 and then moved to the IE900, and I found that to get a reasonably good sound pressure level, I would have to push the volume to close to 100. Now the scale on the Sony goes up to 120, so we're kind of like at roughly 80%. But over on the Shanling, I'm lucky if I have to push it past 20% on their volume dial. So that for me is a much better real world indicator of the low power nature of this Sony Walkman. And before you take to the comment section, yes, I double checked that the AVLS volume limiter setting on the Sony was off and that the media volume was maxed out. And I also made sure that direct sound was turned on so we weren't going through the EQ circuit, because I never use those anyway. However, the more efficient Campfire Andromeda, the new Emerald C version, fared much better than the Sennheiser in terms of volume matching or getting the right sensitivity earphones for the Sony Walkman. So for David Byrne's Raimomo and also David Bowie's Outside album, I needed a volume level of about 60 out of 120, maybe 70 on the David Byrne with those Campfire IEMs. So those are a much better match in terms of, I guess, sensitivity with the Sony Walkman. However, because these earphones, the Campfire Andromeda, are so sensitive, they also pick up some of the circuit noise from the Sony Walkman, and that's not what we want to hear. And I don't get that from the Shanling player when using the Campfire Audio Andromeda Emerald C. no circuit noise there. And that's somewhat unfortunate because I think the Campfire Audio IM is a much more copacetic match from a sound quality perspective to the Sony than any of the Sennheisers that I tried previously. But even with that more copacetic match in mind with the Campfire and the Sony, I still felt like something was missing from the Sony sound quality. Before I get into that, I want to give you a very brief album recommendation. And basically, this is a box set. It's either a 4 CD set or a 7 LP set compiled by Steven Wilson. And it's a compilation of his favourite alternative music tracks from the UK from roughly the 80s, because I think Steven Wilson wants to show people that not all music was shit during the 80s, and that's very true, and there was some great stuff being made out in the left field. But what I like about this compilation is that Wilson hasn't gone for the obvious tracks. So he's put Joy Division on there, but it's not Love Will Tear Us Apart or Transmission. He's put Magazine on there, but it's not Shot by Both Sides. He's put The on there, and it's not This Is the Day. So he's gone for much deeper cuts. And there's a great booklet with the CD edition, I assume so with the LP edition as well. And the thing I love most about this set, that I think is truly wonderful, is that I don't think it's on streaming services at all. I couldn't find it when searching for it. Yes, somebody has tried to compile an equivalent playlist on Spotify, but for now I think what Cherry Red have done, the label that's put this out, is they've said, no, this is just physical formats only. So I had to rip my copy to my hard drive and then copy those files to a micro SD card and then put that in my new Sony Walkman. And listening to that Steven Wilson Intrigue box set and yeah, going through a whole number of different tracks of, I gotta say, varying degrees of audible quality, one thing that I really love about the Sony is that it brings a crispness and a freshness and a clarity to the mid-range on those tracks and other tracks as well. And I really like the delicacy and the finesse that I hear from the Sony when listening to Momus's 20 Vodka Jellies compilation. But the A306 can't quite match the Shanling M3 Ultra when it comes to a sense of mellifluousness. So almost like the tenderness, it's almost like the Sony's top end is, yes, it's crisp, but it's much steelier than what I hear from the Shanling from those same albums, so the Momus and the Steven Wilson Intrigue box. And it goes further than that, because listening to music with the Sony, with the Campfire Audio Andromeda Emerald C, I hear from the Sony a more monochromatic sound, tonally speaking, than I do from the Shanling. The Shanling to me is tonally a bit more colourful or a bit richer, a bit more pleasing. Whereas I think what Sony have gone for here is they've tried to kind of really go straight between the eyes with, I'm guessing, ultra low distortion, and you can hear it, and there isn't that sort of flow to music. It's a bit rigid and a bit mechanical at times, but I'm only talking about minor audiophile differences here and nothing that would trouble the average, I think actually the average Sony new Walkman buyer. I've really been digging that new Fever Ray album recently. I think it's called Radical Romantics. And one other main difference that I noticed between the Shanling and the Sony is that playing that album through the Shanling, there's a weightier bottom end. There's just more push and shove. Whereas I just don't hear that at all from the Sony player. So when I listen to something like Luna's Penthouse, I really can't enjoy it all that much through the Sony and the Andromeda. And it's not the Andromeda because I put that with the Shanling and it sounds fine. And it sounds, yeah, fuller and lusher. Yeah, the Sony makes that Penthouse album sound a little bit emaciated. And it's the same problem with Robert Liner's Visions of the Past, which is a fantastic electronic album from the 90s. I want more bass weight from the Sony and it doesn't give me it. And to me, that's a little bit disappointing. And I went back to the Sennheiser IE900 just to double check this finding, and sure enough, yeah, the Sony is just a bit too lean in the low end. So if I had to pick 3 words to describe the sound of the Sony NW-A306, I would say it's crisp, it's clean, and it's lean. But if you listen to predominantly acoustic music or female vocal or string quartets, then the Sony's more precise, more detailed, but leaner and crisper presentation might be all that you need. But it isn't for me as a fan of rock music and of electronic music. But even with David Byrne's Raimomo, which is a Latin influenced album, there's very little bass on it, I still want more meat on the bone from that record. And the Sony doesn't give me it. But the Shanling, the M3 Ultra, does give me that, especially when I tap its balanced output with the Sennheiser and with the Campfire. Now, I bought the Sony NW-A306 from Amazon, and it's going to go back because I'm not in love with its sound quality. At least that's what I thought until I found out its killer feature. Now, its killer feature has nothing to do with sound quality. And I only discovered this when I loaded the Steven Wilson box set onto a micro SD card and used the Sony Music Player app to listen to its contents. Because the Music Player app, after about 4 seconds of showing you cover art, goes into almost like a screensaver mode where it shows you an old cassette tape turning on the screen. And you get a different type of Sony cassette tape depending upon the quality of the file that you're playing. So if you play an MP3, you get a low quality one. I think if you play a DSD file, you get a metal tape display. And when I played Neil Young and Crazy Horse's Rust Never Sleeps, a 24/192 download that I bought from the Pono store back in the day, almost 10 years ago, you get a different tape player again. So I think that tape player screensaver is unbelievably cool. I know it's not new, but it's the first time I've seen it, and it really hits me right here in the nostalgia gland. So now I'm fully torn. Like, I don't love the sound of the Sony player, but I absolutely adore that sort of cassette tape screensaver. I think it's a screensaver or just a display when you're playing music using the Sony Walkman Music Player app. So it doesn't do it with streaming services. So don't think you can get the cassette tape display when playing something from Spotify or from Apple Music or from Tidal. You can't. It's just from local files. But I just think it's wonderful. So I might send this Sony Walkman back to Amazon, but then again, I might not and use that little cassette display unit just for, it's Instagram gold as far as I'm concerned. I think it looks fantastic. So yeah, I'm really kind of undecided what to do, but I think if you're somebody who is just focused on sound quality and isn't swayed by cassette tape nostalgia in this way as I am, you're probably going to be a little bit disappointed by the sound of the Sony, especially if you listen to, yeah, rock music or electronic music or pop music or anything other than the lighter side of life. So I hope you found this video in some way informative. Now, just as I began editing this video, Sony issued a firmware update for the NW-A306. And that update was designed to tackle a problem with some units, a fault with some units. And digging deeper on this, I found that some people over on HeadFi have reported that some units of the NW-A306 have an issue where the sound is basically shelved down in the bass. And there are graphs on HeadFi, and I'll try and put one on the screen right now, that show that starting at about 200 hertz and going below that, the bass, yeah, slowly moves downwards towards up to, I think, 10 dB down or 10 dB below the rest of the frequency range, which quite frankly, I think is a bit rubbish. And it explains why I have experienced a sense of emaciated bass with my player. And sure enough, after applying the update, the 1.01 update, bass came into fuller bloom when listening to music. And along with that comes a much more vivid sense of macro dynamics. And this firmware update also seems to have addressed the issue with circuit noise bleeding into the sound of high sensitivity earphones like the Campfire Audio Andromeda. And going back to the IE900 from Sennheiser, yeah, that bass gives a fleshier sound in the bottom end. But crucially, the firmware update has not changed the gain structure of this player. So we don't suddenly get more loudness from lower volume levels on the volume dial. I still have to pump the volume to close to 100 out of 120 to get robust levels from the Sennheiser IEM. But there could be a bit of a downside to this update because I took the player on a day trip to Hamburg on the weekend and I was using Rune Arc and I was playing CD quality rips. And I noticed that the Sony Walkman ran out of battery juice from a full charge after about 15 hours, which is a long way south of its roughly 30-hour rating by Sony. But I guess if sound quality is your major interest here, then you should know that I would no longer describe the Sony player as lean. I would just call it crisp and clean. And no, I'm not using the words crisp and clean because I don't know of any other words to use. It really does sound that way. And the Shanling player, which I use as a comparative, doesn't sound crisp and clean. It's more voluptuous in the bottom end. It's slightly more rounded up top, and I think it's a richer sounding player. And actually, I still think the Shanling is the better, more natural sounding player of the two. And the Shanling, let's not forget, has a balanced output. However, I think in light of this 1.01 update, I'm less on the fence than I was previously about returning the Sony to Amazon. I think I'm going to keep it around and try and find other earphones that work well with it. But until then, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it informative or entertaining or a bit of both. And if you did, please give us a like down below. If you like my attitude towards portable audio, specifically digital audio players or portable players, which are now back in my life after, well, I guess a 4 or 5 year absence. I kind of gave up on them about 6 years ago because very few of them, I think only the Sony ZX2 back in 2016, did streaming services. And streaming services were in their ascendancy back then. And players that didn't do it, I was like, no, I'm not using this as a portable audio device. I'm going to get my phone and I'm going to attach a dongle DAC. But now I'm kind of coming back to portable audio players because I think they sound better than phones with dongle DACs. In the main, I'm generalizing there. Please don't at me about that. Please don't. I'm just trying to tell you about my own sort of personal journey with players like the Sony NW-A306. God, who names these things? Anyway, if you dig all of that, then please subscribe to this channel, or at least consider it. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.